Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. There are still some people trickling in, and we're going to give them a couple more minutes to enter. But it'd be nice to just get a sense of who's in the room with us. So if everyone that's here could drop in the chat where they're located and maybe your favorite park in your neighborhood, just to start. Someone from Memphis, Montana, Long Beach, Alaska. Sunset Dunes, that's where I'm from. That's also my favorite park. LA and Philly. Okay, great. It's exciting to see where everyone is coming in from, and we have people from all over the country, which is really exciting. Ross Valley. Okay, awesome. Um, it is 1:03, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. But there's some general housekeeping for today. The webinar is actively being recorded and will be uploaded to CCLR's YouTube channel. You also get an email with instructions on how to find the slides and that link in the next week or so. You can submit questions using the Q&A box at any time, but we will most likely get to these at the end of the webinar when we have a designated time for Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat at any time throughout the webinar for comments or for anything that comes up. That's not a question for the Q&A box. And we're going to be launching some polls throughout the webinar to get some feedback and insight from you all. So I'm just going to launch the first one to make sure that's working and again get a sense of who's with us today. So let's see. That poll should have just come up for all of you guys. Great. I'm just going to give that one more minute. Everybody is at some part of the park development phase, which is exciting to see, and probably expected for today's webinar. Okay, I'm going to leave that up for a few more minutes while everyone's submitting. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Sarah Fingerhood. I am a senior program associate with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, also known as CCLR. Today's webinar is being hosted in collaboration with WRT, the urban planning and design firm that CCLR co-produced the park development guide with us. And the webinar is supported by a grant from US Bank Foundation, and Let's Create a Park, the guide, was developed with support from the US Bank Foundation, the Cliff Bauer Family Foundation, and funding from the US EPA. So I want to say thank you to US Bank for all they've done in supporting our Parks and Open Space initiative as part of their mission and values. So I'm going to move forward with the webinar, and the topics discussed today in today's webinar will build upon the content outlined in the resource and guide that CCLR and WRT published this past May called Let's Create a Park, Planning a Creative Funding Strategy for Successful Park Development. And you can see the cover right here. This is a 20-page resource which includes an appendix with case studies and attempts to aid under-resourced and overburdened communities in one of the most daunting aspects of park development projects, creating viable funding strategies. So this guide will serve as a framework for today's discussion, and if you haven't had a chance to view this resource, we're going to be dropping the link in the chat right now, and you can save that and check it out later. I'm also going to share the results from our earlier poll so you guys can all also see where everybody is at with park development. Okay. So these are our speakers today. There's Madison Merrill and John Gibbs from WRT. They're going to get into the details of the guide, the park development process, its challenges, and the how-tos of creating a successful funding strategy. We are also going to hear from Michael Williams, a trail program manager with the Hayward Area Recreation and Park District, who will provide a community perspective on applying the lessons learned. And you're going to also hear from me, a senior program manager from CCLR. To get started today, I want to introduce CCLR and our Parks and Open Space initiative in order to provide some context on how this guide came to be. And so for those of you who are not familiar, the Center for Creative Land Recycling is a national nonprofit that aims to help communities redevelop abandoned and potentially contaminated land, also known as brownfields, into community assets like parks. We provide cost-free technical assistance for communities in the Western US through a grant with the EPA and low-cost technical assistance for communities outside of our grant regions. So why did CCLR get involved with parks and open space? We have long seen an inverse relationship between the potential opportunity for parks and an inverse relationship and potential opportunity between brownfields and parks. The communities with the fewest parks tend to also have the largest number of contaminated or potentially contaminated sites, which are brownfields. And moreover, there's a disconnect between the communities that need more parks and open space and the communities that have institutional capacity and financial strategy to develop these parks. Parks provide a wide range of health, economic, and social benefits for communities that directly align with the remediation outcomes that drive our mission at CCLR. And ultimately, we recognize that parks are an underutilized end use for brownfields. So how did this guide come to be? In 2023, CCLR decided to invest a grant from US Bank into our growing interest in expanding our expertise and experience in parks and open space. At this stage, our intention was to identify common barriers and gaps that prevented vulnerable communities in California from transforming abandoned or underutilized land into parks, recreation areas, or green spaces. So we conducted a review of over 30 plus vulnerable communities in California that had received federal or state funding for park redevelopment projects. And then from this list, we engaged in one-on-one conversations with 8 of these communities to better understand their experiences. Through these conversations, the biggest challenges that we repeatedly heard were that 1, a lack of funding, and 2, capacity. So in 2024, US Bank renewed their grant with CCLR to further the work we started. At this stage of the project, our goal was now to develop a resource that responded to the needs identified through our preliminary research. And our next step was to partner with WRT to develop what would become the Park Funding Framework Guide. We chose to work with WRT given their extensive background in park master plans with unique attention to equity and reinvestment. At an early stage in our resource development, we formed the Community Advisory Panel, a diverse panel of park professionals, local government representatives, community members, and advocates who each shared invaluable expertise and insight into the challenges and opportunities of park development. This panel reviewed our work at 3 separate phases, helping us to produce a document that accurately reflects a wide range of community needs. In May of 2025, nearly a year later, we published Let's Create a Park. And today marks the first leg of promoting this document, but we hope to offer future programming in the near future. And so be sure to subscribe to CCLR's newsletter to stay updated on any of these opportunities. So that is a brief overview and introduction to the park guide and how it came to be. I have our agenda here today. We're already down one. We just did the introduction. So before I hand it over to John to get into the park overview, and as we dive deeper into creating a funding strategy and the process of park development and room for case studies at the end, I just want to say that ultimately, this guide isn't just about parks, it's about building capacity, partnerships, and confidence in navigating complex funding systems. We hope communities can use this resource in numerous ways as a planning tool, as a funding roadmap, a teaching tool, or just a confidence booster when you feel overwhelmed along the way. And no matter what, the folks presenting today are here to help. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have a slide on how to best contact CCLR if you want to talk about any of these topics further. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to John.
Hello, all you awesome parks people out there. Welcome to Let's Fund a Park. Starting here, John Gibbs, WRT, and starting here with something you guys all know really well. That's why you're here. That's why you're invested in your parks, in your open spaces, in your community, because you understand the value of parks and recreation. And I think we just need to always remind ourselves, we need to remind others the value of parks, the value of parks and recreation related to community health, related to the social gathering of folks, the knitting of people together within our communities. There's economic benefits of parks within communities. How do we attract new employers and new employees to regions? How do we maintain a healthy population? There's economic benefits of parks and a lot of really good research about this, and certainly natural resources as well. And so let's just start there. But then let's go to the next slide for a quick just a quick story of some inspiration, something that was a real success story in this community. This is the Calwa Recreation and Park District in Fresno. It's within the city of Fresno, but it does not receive any funding from the city because it's its own district. Serves a couple thousand people in a pretty low income area, so it's not bringing in a lot of revenues. And the park kind of shows that as well. It's a pretty dilapidated park, but it's kind of the center of the community in terms of social center, jobs, organization, meeting spaces. And what was really important was that this small, scrappy parks district partnered with a local nonprofit who had a little bit of seed funding from just their general funding sources and philanthropy in order to launch a master plan. And this will be a little bit of a theme today of starting broad and starting with vision. And so, with a very small amount of money, put together a vision and a master plan for this park in order to identify what are the real needs in the community, what do we have to work with. And I think similar to the grant, really tapped into really important themes of economics, of entrepreneurship, and of the community coming together, also around play, wellness, kids. Lots of improvement projects came out of this, but ultimately decision was made to focus in on playground and market and food as a vibrancy and a hub for the community. And ultimately, yeah, this got a $7 million or a little bit more from state of California Prop 68. That's a success story. But I think that the takeaway, because those are really hard fought kinds of wins, the takeaway was that partnership with the nonprofit to help write, position a grant, bring in some flexible initial seed money. The fact that this project tapped into the soul of this community, a lot of passion. And in fact, the community engagement was really strong, but I would say it struggled at first until we realized that Facebook Live was actually how this community spoke to each other. And we were able to tap into that. And so we live streamed all of our engagement. We live streamed tours, in addition to certainly all the normal, really strong engagement that was being done. And it really turned into a really big deal. And then the other thing was the hook. The rocket ship was something that the grantors who had reviewed this application told us later. They knew that the playground was going to be great. They knew that the picnic area and stuff was going to be awesome, but they were really excited about the rocket. So I think this idea of finding the hook in your place, that the symbol of your community coming together, find that within our projects. And in this case, it was this cool 50s rocket. This was built in the era of celebrating space exploration, and every grown-up in the Fresno area that have ever come to this park remembers being so scared climbing to the top of this rocket ship. And so tap into something within your community that's really powerful. And this rocket ship kind of galvanized the application and in fact really ignited the hope and the spirit of the grant funders. So I hope that's a fun story to help us find our inspiration as we continue on this journey here today. The next slide. So again, some important framing here. What is the park development process? Again, I think you guys all know this pretty well, but it's important that we just understand these different stages. Certainly for a new park, we need to acquire this parkland. But sometimes we may have an old park or we may already have a piece of land and we need to do some additional assessment, whether that's a phase 1 or a phase 2, because it's a brownfield. CCLR has resources and partnerships to help with those kinds of processes with parks. But to recognize if we need to acquire a park, that may take some different kinds of funding sources than others. Certainly engaging and designing these things need to happen in partnership. We need deep involvement and deep championing by our communities to come up with a vision and tap into that spirit, the rocket or the play or the place of food where people come together to share a meal. Tap into that sort of a spirit. Um, but it's also important, as you're going to see through this process, to tie that back to these kinds of funding sources that are out there. And Madison's going to go into that in a lot more detail. Certainly, we need to design or detail, and we need to build, but this is often a little different step. This is maybe a different funding source to really the larger dollar amounts associated with the detailed design and then ultimately the construction of the project. And we'll remind you, because you would remind us if we didn't mention this, it takes a lot of money to maintain and operate a park. And even a small district like Cowell Park District, it's going to be a little difficult. And so we're helping them with that ongoing O&M side of the project as well. And I think many of you know this pretty well, but want to be sure to mention that. Moving forward, so we certainly all know this process. We love parks. We know what the design process and the implementation process maybe could be, but there's some real challenges. And so we have our needs, but we've got some pretty limited resources for all stages of that park. So what do we need? We really need a creative funding story. Prop 68 and those big one-time big grants are really hard to come by. And that program has now shifted into some other phases. So we're going to be talking about stacking funding. We're going to be talking about aligning to grant funding and these different themes within our parks and to the funding sources and come up with something great. And that's what this strategy that we've published really does. It also really taps into what we found to be some of the best lists of park funding that's out there. And there's some really important links over to Change Lab, um, over to the City Parks Alliance, who have done also their own really great research, but really digging a little more deeply into those park funding sources. So you guys have a um, have a question up.
Yeah, I just want to hop in that this is one of the interactive polls that we mentioned, but we just want to hear from you guys as well of what challenges you have experienced in your own park development. So I'm leaving that poll up and I'll leave it there for about a minute and we can all look at the results in just a second.
Excellent. So yeah, in the document that you guys are going to be able to download, there's just a whole series of active links. And if something's not working, please let us know. But those links take you to different project examples that have grant funding descriptions within them, also community process descriptions. And then there's also these links over to a couple of these really important resources. And some groups have really done some pretty detailed work on outlining and identifying so many different funding sources that we didn't need to recreate that wheel, but we've certainly showcased them. And huge props to City Parks Alliance and others. I think, Madison, you can take us through the steps that we've outlined in the document.
Great, yeah. So thank you, John. So first of all, what is a creative funding strategy? As John mentioned, it really is about applying multiple funding sources at different phases of the project. So that way there's a reduced need for just focusing on one source. It really requires, multiple agencies and partners and just people coming together to really make these projects a reality.
And
Next
just
slide.
Oh,
Yeah.
just chiming in, the document has a number of little sidebar case studies. And so on that previous slide, you saw one from East 14th Street and some, a really good story there of cobbling together funding to both remediate a site, but also to ultimately build a park.
Great. So the guide outlines 5 steps for building a creative funding strategy. Obviously, in real life, it's not so linear and it's more iterative. But I'm going to just walk you through some of the details for each step here. So the first step is understanding. It really is important to really understand your site and your community, both so that way you can have a successful project that responds to, your site's constraints and also to your community, but also so you can tell a compelling funding story through your applications. So some things that are really important to understand is your site's size and scope, if it has any special characteristics or context, such as are the soils contaminated? Is there special access or constraints? Is there sensitive habitat? And then also understanding your community. So, what are your community's demographics, age, income, race, and ethnicity? And what are their needs? You really need a robust community engagement process to understand, the community's needs that this project will be serving. Your organization's leadership. So what are your city council's priorities? You got to make sure that, your project responds to that. So that way you have the backing and the support that you need. And similarly, are there any partners that can help, you gain momentum and really implement the project and maybe even help you fund the project? Um, so next slide here. And so then this is really when you can then take what you've learned and start building a project vision and really start clarifying what this project will look like in the future. And it is from here that we can then start talking about and thinking about funding. So this is an example from Ashland Zocalo Park in Ashland, California. This is a design. As you can see, different aspects of the park can apply to different sorts of topics. So when thinking about funding, I think the first step we often think of is, okay, I have a park, let me look for grants that apply to parks. And that is a great first step. But there's also additional sources that we can go a little deeper and start thinking about what we understand about our site, our community, and our vision for this park, and really start figuring out if there's other opportunities available. So for a few examples here, this design features a tile installation on a building. This could apply to arts and cultural funding. There's also stormwater retention cells underneath the plaza. Perhaps we could tap into some stormwater management grant opportunities. There's improved crosswalks that connects to an adjacent schools. So could we, tap into safe routes to schools, see if there's any funding for that. There's pollinator habitat, could connect to wildlife and biodiversity. There's fitness stations and a multi-use recreation space. Potentially, we could start thinking about funding for public health. So you sort of get the idea that there really is so much more out there depending on, what your vision is and what your site characteristics are and what your community characteristics are. So this brings us to step 2, identifying funding sources based on kind of our understanding. So there's 2 main buckets here. The first is municipal funding tools. So these are things like the general fund and development fees, bonds, special taxes. And then there's also grant funding opportunities, whether it be from a federal level, at the state, maybe a regional agencies, or even like private or nonprofit organizations. And oftentimes it really requires a mix of both of these because as we know, grants often require matches. So we really, need those municipal funding tools as well. And as John mentioned, there are a lot of resources linked in the guide. We unfortunately can't go over all the great funding opportunities out there, so I really encourage you to look at some of the sources we have linked there. Just touching on a few relevant opportunities at the federal level, since we're all from different places, these are sort of what's most relevant for all of us. The Land and Water Conservation Fund and Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership are two big federal sources that many of you are probably already familiar with. They provide over 900 million in grants annually for outdoor recreation. There are also big funds such as the Recreational Trails Program, Community Development Block Grants Program, and US Stop Build Program, all of which are big grant funds that can apply to parks and recreation projects. Um, and then there's the state level. We are all from different states here. I have listed a few key opportunities for California as that is where we are based, but each state has its own set of opportunities and they all address similar topics such as recreation and tourism, active transportation, natural resources and conservation, and more. So definitely encourage, diving deep there. All right, and then as we search for funding, we also really have to think about the project's entire life cycle, as John mentioned. There's always a lot of attention paid to the capital investment, the actual construction of the project, and that is, very costly. So it makes sense to put a lot of emphasis there, but we also need to start thinking about operations and maintenance and also life cycle replacement for when the project ages and needs to be replaced. And these sources are often need to be supported through municipal funding tools because there are less grant opportunities there. So that is something that we have to pay special attention to as well as we start thinking about funding.
And an important chime in on Measure P in Fresno. This is a funding stream that was championed by the public after a citywide Parks and Recreation master plan that recognized that the simple math, there's not enough money in the budget to properly maintain and run a park system. And so it was really an O&M issue that they were facing. And the community recognized that, and instead of seeking bond funding, championed a sales tax measure. Now, this is obviously a really big lift for a lot of communities. And in the case of Fresno, that was not a real tax-friendly community, and there was a fair amount of political opposition. But ultimately, it was passed, and it's generating $30 to $60 million a year of pretty unrestricted funds, although they, to their credit, did direct a percentage of the funds to high need areas, areas that experienced extreme poverty, perhaps specific criteria like low birth weights or high mortality rates. So areas of the community that really had some of the highest need from a real data-driven perspective did receive some additional funds. So an important measure worth looking up as a story that may be able to be applied to your community.
Great. So that leads us to step 3, sequence and stack. So once you have your leads for funding sources, it's time to think about how can we sequence them across the development process and how can we stack them on top of each other so we can really have multiple funding sources feeding into the full, construction and operations and maintenance of this project. There's a few key considerations that we have to think about here as we do this. The first, again, is grant matching. So even if we are to get a grant, we also have to have some other funds to help provide money for that match. We also need backup options. We have big ideas, but not all of them pan out, and oftentimes opportunities are competitive. So we need to be flexible there. And then lastly, it's timing. Different funding sources require different amount of time to get it processed and different application cycles, and it never quite aligns. So there's definitely requires a lot of flexibility and planning ahead of time. And then step 4 is secure. So now you have your plan and it's time to apply. And no matter the funding strategy, whether it be a municipal funding source or a grant, securing funding really requires a lot of effort and strategy to be able to tell a compelling story that will result in success. The guide does provide some general guidance for success, which really revolves around demonstrating a commitment and intention for your project, communicating clear and well thought out plan. I'm really highlighting how the project will impact the community. I'm using data and visuals to support this and really tell a compelling story, demonstrating partnerships, that there are a lot of, people and organizations backing your project, all really to just really demonstrate, you know, the momentum and the support that your project has. And then lastly, just want to mention leveraging resources. There's a lot of technical assistance out there. Some funding agencies have resources for you as you are applying for the grant. You can reach out to them and they can help with your application. You can also, there's private organizations and agencies that help with grant assistance as well. So that could be a well-worthy investment. And then finally, the last step is managing. You have your funding, but unfortunately, the work is not quite over. Many funding sources, particularly grants, require tracking compliance to requirements. You have to track your budgets, you have to do reporting, and all of this requires a lot of time and energy. And again, you're likely probably also sequencing and stacking and finding sources as you do it. So we really just have to be nimble and flexible. So with that, I will give it back to John and then Michael to go
Yeah.
over some case studies.
Yeah, a
Just bef
couple.
Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Just before we hop into case studies, I wanted to launch one more poll that's related to resources. And again, we're just asking these questions because we've done a lot of work trying to identify how to support park development. And this is having you all in the room is an amazing opportunity. Sorry, it's my dog sneezing. Amazing opportunities to get more information about how we can best support you guys. So we're just throwing out one more poll, and then we will move on to case studies.
All
And
right. Should I
yeah, go ahead and
launch, Sarah, while we're
yeah.
wrapping this up?
Yeah.
Um, do your poll, everybody. I was going to do a little case study. We've got a couple of these, and these are also pretty well described in the document, also their funding sources. And I hope they're inspiring and reinforce a couple of things. One is start with some visioning, start pretty open-ended, think about grant funding themes and begin to integrate those pretty seamlessly into your visioning, into your community dialogue. You're going to find yourself more aligned to funding if you come in a little bit more creatively. So in the case of Mariposa, up in the foothills, this is Mariposa County, so this is unincorporated. This is not wealthy. And this is rural, and those are sometimes a bit of a sweet spot and sometimes a challenging place to find funding in our rural communities. Um, Here, we started with a master plan, and really to the credit of the county, they thought really broad. This is physically, this is a trail along a creek, kind of behind the Main Street buildings in the downtown of Mariposa. But in fact, it had the potential to extend up to some senior housing. It extended up to some particularly low income areas. It also connected folks to school, and it offered an opportunity for a really different sense of place and a different identity for the community, one that was much more refreshed and looking forward, both to its peoples, as well as to its tribal influences, to restoration along the creek, and to just a really different place. So the 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 master plan and the engagement really centered around recreation and access, trails in particular, transportation, focused on education, really tapping into youth within the community. And it touched on health and wellness. And in fact, a 3-day community event celebration, 1 day was dedicated to each of those themes. So really from the start, really thinking more broadly. So the next slide. And I think that that master plan then really did a good job of setting them up for lots of different ways to fund this vision. And so certainly Caltrans and sustainable transportation programs were really important related to active transportation, both on the planning, but ultimately through the ATP program, through Caltrans, the Caltrans Active Transportation Program, into the millions of dollars that could fund some implementation. Again, some of the trail components. Sierra Nevada Conservancy, these California conservancies, whether it's the San Joaquin River, whether it's Baldwin Hills, whether it's Sierra Nevada, or the State Coastal Conservancy, these are the folks that are receiving pretty significant funds still from Prop 68 and other various state of California sources. They're still receiving this money, and they're in charge of this disbursement. The new climate bond, SB4, similarly, that money is being funded, or that money is flowing through these different conservancies. So pay attention to those conservancies. They often have more flexible and rolling windows for grants and such. There was the California Urban Greening Program. That's a really important one. There's an upcoming grant, which is an outgrowth of that, kind of focuses on youth and parks and the outdoors. So the fact that we tapped into education of youth as part of this and telling story of ecology, telling story of indigenous practices. There's cool community burns. This is a really fantastic community coalition that's come together up in the town of Mariposa. Taps into perhaps some of these more unique funding sources related to urban greening and youth. And there's also just a lot of ecological restoration work that's been going on in the parkway, removing of blackberry bushes and creek restoration, et cetera. So lots of different funding sources that this particular project was able to tap into, setting a pretty big umbrella initially. So read more about it. And I think we're going to shift over. Oh, wait, before I go, there was a big master plan, and obviously it needs a lot of long-term funding in order to try to implement it. But I wanted to show a little highlight here on the arts, and through the Arts Council within Mariposa. They tapped into both some federal and state funding that was not huge dollar amounts, but they were able to conduct a pretty important community engagement process, again, tapping in with tribes in particular, as well as youth. And they were able to then fund a series of murals. They hired the nicest, coolest muralist to do this really beautiful work. And it's a physical early win within the community to demonstrate change, to demonstrate the public's input about the importance of ecology, the importance of indigenous culture and practices emerging within the community, different than the mining and some of the century of pretty traditional themes, very new themes, and really exciting to folks. So again, check out Mariposa. They're doing some pretty cool work. And now I'm going to go over to Michael.
Hi, Michael C. Williams. I'm from the Hayward Area Recreation and Park District. We're in Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area, East Bay, just a little south of Oakland. And Hayward, we're a California special district, kind of unique in that we do parks and recreation services and facilities for the city of Hayward as a whole, but we also do it for a large swath of unincorporated Alameda County. So we really serve two populations, and our service area combined is about 310 or 315,000 residents. So it kind of gives us the perspective of working with lots of different communities across that area. And one of the projects that we have that came to light through it's been on the books for about 20 years as an idea. It goes way back, but it's basically to take a channelized portion of the Alameda County Flood Control District's service road alongside a creek bed and their flood control channel, and take that road and turn it into a Class 1, California Class 1 bike ped multi-use path facility. And so the description is here, and you can see one of the things that we did that made this work for a long time when they first, before I got to the agency, the agency applied to ATP funding here in California, our active transportation program with Caltrans for funding, and they got a very low score because one of the things that the reviewer said was, well, recreation trails shouldn't be in the active transportation program, and so therefore you get this low score. And so when I came to the agency and had a chance to review the application while we were getting ready for the next cycle, one of the things I thought is like, well, we've got to get rid of that. This is Class 1 bike ped facility is active transportation, and it's not just for recreation. Recreation can be a part of that, but there are job centers, there's transit, there's lots of other locations and destinations that we want to connect to. And so that was one of the things that we did, was look for the transit connections. And so that's definitely one of the takeaways, especially for this facility, given the length and breadth of it, was to connect to transit. And so that's one of the things that we made an emphasis on. And it's kind of hard to see in this map, but the Creekway is basically goes east to west, but there are components all within the creek shed area that we have connections to 3 different BART facilities. We have connections to Amtrak facility 1 and bus routes. And so that's one of the things that helped get our score up by 20 plus points in our second round. And then even then we had to apply like 3 different times. But that's one of the key takeaways. And then the other one that helped us with funding on this was connecting to safe routes. It used to just be safe routes to school, then it was safe routes to transit. Now it's safe routes to parks, and plus we wanted to connect to our own parks and facilities. We have facilities throughout the area. We have 110 facilities in our service area, and many of them are connected or adjacent to this planned trail. And so we want to connect, parks and connect people to parks through the trail. And so if we go to the next slide, please, I'll just give you an idea where we're located in the Bay Area in case anyone's not familiar. And then this is kind of like what the channel looks like. And so 2/3 of the 10 miles is this channel, but the rest are on-street components. So that's another thing we had to look for, was how do we connect to transit? How do we take advantage of on-street access to get to some of the other destinations in the project? And so if we go to the next slide, we put together a plan and applied again to the Caltrans active transportation program. And so that's the bulk of the money came $17 million from them. We applied to the MTC's One Bay Area grant, $10 million. And then the matching funds, $3 million was set aside from our HARD's F1 bond, which had been issued back in 2016 or 2017. And then we have $3 million match in public and private developments that have occurred along the Creekway. And then there's a $3 million that's kind of ongoing. So it's kind of, I think someone mentioned earlier, we almost never stop with this because, we've had projects that were supposed to be developed and the developers pulled out and someone else had to, take over, or the project sat. And so we're kind of on the hook for that $3 million matching. And so we are constantly applying to other grant opportunities and funding opportunities that we're looking for. But one of the things that was said earlier too was about knowing your community and about bringing people together. And especially for something that's this extensive, it was important to get all of the partners, and this is just a partial list just to show you at least just the public agency partners at a minimum that had to come together to work on this. And so it's one of those things, this is, this won't fit everyone's scope, and everyone won't have access to a project this large, but it just goes to show that these projects like this do exist. LA County is familiar with the LA River, and so they have other projects, several like this. But even for these large projects, there are things that you have to do, and in looking for funding, you have to connect the dots, and you have to connect the resources, connect the public agencies, show all the stakeholders what the public benefit of working collectively is. If we tried to do this, if our agency just did this in a silo, or if the county just did it, flood control did it in their own silo, nothing would happen. But you have to get out of your silo, and you have to find other agencies and show them the benefit of working together and the collaborative effort. That's one project. I could do a whole hour presentation on this, and I have actually done it before, and some people on this call know that. But we're going to move on to another project, just that's the complete opposite. We also have a new project that just came out. It's Carol Pereira Park. Carol Pereira happens to be one of our longest serving board members who's still alive, and they wanted to honor her with a park which is still alive. Well, oftentimes people get something, named after them in memoriam, and we wanted to do it. So our board opted to name this after her. And so, but the thing about it is, and there was a slide earlier, I should have kept up with it, that talked about building kind of like a quilt, like different pieces that, you're not doing everything out all at once. You may not necessarily have the vision to do everything all at once. This project came about, it was not on our CIP radar. We did an acquisition for it because we had the opportunity. We don't necessarily land bank, but we do look for opportunities to acquire land, but didn't have in mind to do a park right away necessarily. It was like, oh, land became available. We bought 2 parcels. And the thing that came next was we were also building a trail. And so there was a trail, and the trail was going to go through there. And so we said, well, we'll take the trail and we'll run it through these 2 empty parcels, not thinking necessarily about the park because there was no money or plans for the park at that point. But as we ran the foothill trail through, or a segment of it through that park or through the parcels, we looked at opportunities to do park or trail amenities. And pretty soon in building those out, it's like, well, this is almost kind of like a park. And so we started thinking, well, if we just kind of brought our plans together, what could we do? And so we went to the community, talked to the local residents about what they would like to see. If we're going to have a trail, if it turns into a park, what would you like to see? And here's some community feedback. This was really important because this is in a neighborhood that doesn't have any parks within like a half mile or more. And there's nothing that's natural. It's like a small urban forest. And so the community was very dead set on making sure that we preserve the natural aspect of it. It does turn out to be, there's deer that go through there and migrate, turkeys and, birds. And so that was like a big draw for the community. And if we'll go to the next slide, please. Basically, we ended up with this plan. It's 2 parcels. There's a creek that goes through there, and we're going to bridge the creek with the trail. And again, this is one of those things where funding for the acquisition was done just as a standalone item. And then once we looked at some capital money for the trail segment, it's like, what other things could we layer on top of that? And so one of the biggest thing is it's kind of like you're really pulling together. It's like a quilt, because again, we didn't have the vision all at once that we were going to put a park here and it was going to look like this. It was acquired property. Oh, now we have a trail. If we add that, if we expand that, and then pulling in funding as we went, and collectively we ended up with this park. And so one of the key takeaways for this in particular was to show the grantors the context and that, how it was an urban forest, rare opportunity, community support for, and we tied it to other projects we have. We have a nature center that's within a half a mile of it, and it's on the same creek in a different location. But, we showed how like we framed it as like they were satellite facilities, within each other. You could go to one, look at the nature center and see the animals that are there. And then you could come to this location and see, animals in the wild, all within, half a mile of each other. And so things like that, you have to look for ways to sell it. And so that's kind of one of the things that we did. And this park is in development currently. So that is kind of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. So that is the end of our webinar. We are going to have some time for Q&A. Again, please feel free to use the Q&A box to submit any questions, or if you want to unmute and talk, you're welcome to do that as well. But before we get into that, I just want to again say here's a QR code for accessing the document to review this Let's Create a Park, and you can go into anything that we talked about today in some more detail. But also, if you have any more detailed questions about your community or a brownfield or a potential park in your own area, please feel free to email me at sarah.fingered@cclear.org, or you can sign up for a technical assistance intake meeting with CClear via this Calendly link, which is also available on our website. So with that, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them or unmute yourself. So we have one question in the chat. It is, how does one officially partner with a nonprofit? Does it have to be in writing? This person has talked to a few and all say they would love to help, but their involvement is low. John or Michael, I don't know if you guys want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think that we've partnered, and as both community members as well as professional practice firms partnered with nonprofits, and I think that it's a really great way, a great way to go about it. We've worked with Building Healthy Communities in Fresno in particular, and we're really aligned in terms of values. So I guess the recommendation maybe coming out of that example is find a group that you're really aligned with, find a group that is can receive funding and isn't daunted by some of the administrative functions. They're going to be able to certainly charge some overhead, so they're going to get some value out of the deal. Sometimes there's like a 10% limit for their staff time to help administer this. But it takes some work, and dealing with Caltrans in particular isn't easy. So find a nonprofit that is not only aligned with you in terms of values and I think an openness to a process, not too foregone conclusion around a very specific outcome that maybe won't be aligned with the grant funding, but also just that that administrative capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that path is also really helpful, I think, with some of the conservancies as well. Reaching out to the conservancies I had mentioned before, and there's some pretty important ones statewide. And the nonprofit can be an alternative to the city, as as also a potential sponsor of a grant. But we got to make sure that you're aligned with your city or the landowner, certainly as well. But I think it does make a stronger case within a grant.
Mm-hmm. There's a question in the chat about if CClear's technical support is limited to brownfield sites or generally available for park projects. And I would say that while CClear, we generally work with sites with brownfields, I would say that the definition of brownfields is broad and it involves or encompasses more than one would expect. And so we can take on park projects. I guess I would say I would schedule a TA intake call with us to discuss the park project, and there is most likely a relationship there that we could assist with. But to know that specific situation, we would have to talk further. If no one else has another question, I have one for our panelists. How do you find out? There's another question in the chat. How do you find out the CIPs that are available for specific areas? John, Madison, or Michael, do you guys want to address that one?
Um, CIPs are usually, um, if I'm reading the question correctly, these are usually capital improvement projects that are already defined, and those are usually available through city council meeting agendas and various department reports. Public Works or Parks would be the two relevant ones for certainly for park type projects. And yeah, you can usually find those online. And they indicate usually a couple years of forecast of potential projects, but they're not necessarily the ones that are always specifically funded. And there's always some nuance to that within your specific community.
Mhm. There's another question related to brownfields in the chat. Is there specific funding available for brownfield remediation prior to park project being implemented? Yes, there is. Again, if you have a specific brownfield remediation project in your community, I would highly recommend signing up for a TA intake with CCLR. Once we have a better sense of your community, your location, demographics, we can direct you towards relevant funding opportunities. But yes, there are funding available for brownfield remediation. There's a follow-up to the CIP question, which is so our councilmen and women would have access to those CIP information.
Yeah, that should be all something that's presented to them as part of budget meetings within your municipality.
Mhm.
Great, and I'm seeing round 5 of, I'm assuming that that's Prop 68. Okay, this is the outdoors for all. Great. Yeah, good to see that that's coming back online through state parks. So there's a great link in the chat. Thanks
Mhm.
we'll take the crowdsourcing for sure.
Great. Well, we're just about right on time. It's about to be 2 p.m. So I think we're going to wrap this up. Again, if any other questions come up, feel free to reach out to sarah.finger@cclear, even if it's for Michael or WRT, I can make that connection. And we'd be happy to hear from you guys. We appreciate all of you coming today, all of your feedback during the polls, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for making parks happen. We want more of them, and so anything we can do to help. Thank you guys.
Keep doing your great work.
Mhm.